on go. Ah, it's already past.
Click on go. Where is click on go?
No, that's why. Where's... Is it only Romain or...
Reprendre
at the top.
le
Restart recording.
I believe that is that one.
Yep.
Oh, no, pause the recording. So it's already recording.
Okay. We start. Oops, I turn off my video and microphone.
Zelina, I turn off my video because I believe you are the first one. So I leave to you.
Hello, everyone. I think waiting for my presentation material to come up. But welcome to the ISO Climate Standards virtual conference. Oops. Okay, I think we're having some technical difficulties trying to get the presentation. We'll just wait a little while. Okay, let me share my screen with you. So I hope you can all, oops, okay. Hi, let me share my screen. Right. Okay, so I hope you can see that. Um, I have a short presentation to just explain a little bit about the ISO climate standards, the landscape and challenges. I'm currently vice chair of ISO TC 207 Subcommittee 7 on greenhouse gases and related activities. Sorry, some problem with the screen sharing. Yeah. At present, I think many of you may have heard from the news report, the results from the UNEP emissions gap report 2019, and that is very worrying because with the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the moment, the expectation is unless we do something very critical now, we are expecting to go into a scenario of about 3.2 degrees centigrade rise in the global mean temperature. And this is something that, in fact, the survey of World Economic Forum Global Risk Report earlier this year also indicated that many people have the perception that environmental disasters, climate disasters, are one of the top risks that will have big impact on the world. And so I think this is where the Subcommittee 7 standards on mitigation and adaptation are very important. Okay, so in this last 2 years, we have had a lot of reports from the IPCC, from the Global Warming 1.5 report, the Climate Change and Land report, and only recently the Ocean and Cryosphere in Changing Climate report. All of these are indicating that we need to be very serious and that countries have to take immediate action. So among the items in the Paris Agreement, you can see on the listing leading towards the global stock take in 2020 in the next 5-year monitor of what is happening. The main topics are the interaction among the emissions, climate risk, and the development pathways, mitigation and adaptation related to development, as well as sustainable development. And another very important aspect is finance and the means of support for all of these actions. I'm glad to say that Subcommittee 7 has been very active in developing standards. And we have a number of standards both for mitigation and adaptation. This diagram shows the list of all our standards at present and including the standards which are under development. So today you will have the chance to hear the presentations related to the adaptation and mitigation. Some of the standards related to finance is under development now, and we think this is something very important. In fact, in about 2 days' time in Paris, there will be a separate conference related to financing and climate change action. You can see that for the mitigation action, we have a long history going back to the Kyoto Protocol. Some of the important ones are related to greenhouse gas accounting for organization, project, and more recently we have changed the technical specification for carbon footprint to become a standard. And in this last year and this year too, we have some updates for the verification and validation of the accounting. And more recently, we have some development for radiative forcing management as well as on carbon neutrality. We also are participating in developing sector-based standards, for example, carbon footprint of transport, and for GHG in energy-intensive industries. But in the Paris Agreement, there is also the concern about adaptation. So this year, we released a new standard, 14090, which is the framework for adaptation action. And we hope soon to have 2 more standards, one on assessment of vulnerability and another on adaptation planning for local governments. But the most important thing for us is to know from the users what are the difficulties and if there are enough standards and guides to help in taking climate action, and what else users want. Some experts from DNV GL have made a position paper in 2017 asking 3 critical questions. One is, which standards, including the measures, are needed to support business actions? So it's not just governments, but the business actions. The second one is, which standards, including the measure here. Which elements, number 2 in the bottom center, which elements can be standardized and what should be standardized and integrated to sustainability goals. And thirdly, what types of standards and standard development processes can contribute to transformative change for businesses? So these are some of the questions we would like you to think about, and perhaps you can bring up some questions for the other speakers when they make their presentations. With that, I will pass you back to the chair Ms. Romain, and if you have any questions. You can write some questions. Okay, you can write the questions in the public chat, and I can see them.
Zelina, I
Yes.
believe there are some problem with Romain, some technical problem.
Yes.
So probably I may take over.
Take over? That's fine. Yeah.
Now. Obviously, if there are any questions from directly to you from the audience.
Yes. I'm looking also at the public chat, so if they type it in, then I can also answer there.
Okay, so maybe I may start with my presentation.
Yes, okay. So Daniele can take over.
Yes. Okay, I hope this is my presentation that you may. No, it's not mine. This is a Céline presentation. So if it's possible to have my presentation, otherwise I will share my screen. Do you see my screen now? Yes, this is my presentation. Yeah. Okay. So next one, please. Okay. So we had some technical problem, but at the end we succeed. And thank you to invite me to have this presentation. I'm Daniele PERNIGOTTI. I was the convener of the working group responsible to the revision of ISO TS 14067 for the publication of the standard and the new standard on carbon footprint of products. I was also convener of other working group at the national and international level, like circular economy. And but I want to go straight to the topic. The topic is the carbon footprint of product. That is a way to quantify the GHG emission, the emission connected with the greenhouse gases, in the whole life cycle of a product. So is based on the LCA methodology, life cycle assessment, but taking in consideration only a single impact category of climate change. And the result is expressed in CO2 equivalents. The standard has been published the 20th August of last year, and it's very important to underline that the content of the standard now is in connection with the quantification of carbon footprint of products. In the previous technical specification, also communication was included, but now the standard is focused only on the quantification. Another important stuff is that to underline that the ISO standard is always more in connection with the UNEF CCC approach. Also, Zelina mentioned before that we may have different interpretation, but I would say that there are 4 principal strands in the UNFCCC: MRVA, monitoring, reporting, verification, and accreditation; the mitigation, adaptation, and as mentioned before, Zelina, very important, is also climate finance. For this presentation, we look only in the area of MRVA, and in particular 4067. And it's important to remember that this standard helps the company to identify which are the most critical life cycle stages of their products. So it's important to identify the most critical life cycle stages, because it's the first step in direction of a very active, more active mitigation intervention. So to know the critical phases, critical stages, is the first step before to start with the mitigation action, with effective mitigation action. In this direction, it's quite interesting to underline that the standard introduced the CFP performance tracking, and this is exactly an example in direction of the mitigation, because it's a way to compare 2 different products over time in order to underline which is the benefit of a specific action, mitigation action. And we will have a presentation in particular in connection with a pharmaceutical product next week at the COP25, where we will show how the use of this standard help a company to reduce the emission. Another, in my view, very interesting innovative approach of the new ISO 40067 is the CFP systematic approach. So, because often the company have the need to produce a lot of different CFP because they have a large number of products in their portfolio. It's not possible to carry out all the time a new CFP. So the CFP systematic approach is a way to combine together management aspects with a collection and the use of CFP data. And this is very important because it helps the company to quantify the CFP, but also it's very important to simplify the verification process. And in connection with the simplification of the verification process, there is also the cost reduction in terms of verification. I mentioned before that the new standard is focused only on quantification, but we know that the communication is very, very important, in particular on this kind of topic when it's connection with the product. And ISO produced another standard, 40026, for the communication of the footprint information. And this implies the establishment of CFP program operator focused on communication. And then we have some example of national CFP program operator. You see Carbon Trust in UK, you see the Taiwan, then there is the Japanese on the bottom, black and blue. The CO2 in the middle is Italian carbon footprint Italy. And then you see Korea and also Thailand. So some example of national CFP program operator that is responsible to establish a transparent and effective communication process. But another very important aspect in connection with ISO standard is the possibility to have a full package of standard in connection with the implementation of carbon footprint of organization or carbon footprint of product. So as you may see in these slides, on the bottom right, you see one organization that is implementing, for example, a CFP, so ISO 40067, or what will be described later by Romain POIVET, ISO 40064 Part 1. So this is the organization using an ISO standard. And this organization want to show to the market the reliability of the result. And they ask a verification body to assure the result of this activity. And the verification body use another ISO standard. It's ISO 40064 Part 3, describing how to carry out the verification activities. And another level of guarantee in connection with ISO family is that this verification body needs to be recognized on the market. And this verification body will ask for the accreditation involving the national accreditation body. So we have Accredita in Italy, you have COFRAC in France, there is UCAS UK. So these accreditation bodies are responsible to check how the verification body is working and to confirm the capacity to work in a proper way. And the standard in connection with this activity, for accreditation activity, is ISO 40065. Maybe many companies will know this standard in connection with the ETS, Emission Trade Scheme, because it's the accreditation standard also for ETS. And then there is another important level that is in connection with the control between different national accreditation bodies. And this is performed at the international forum level, could be the European level, European Cooperation for Accreditation, or the international level with the International Accreditation Forum. And here, another ISO standard is ISO 7011 that is important to give a guarantee to the market that all national accreditation body works the same way in different countries. And this kind of approach involving different ISO standard is the base for the establishment of MLA, multilateral agreement. And the MLA is based on ISO standard, on ISO rules, and is fundamental because you see the regional federation, EA, as mentioned before, European Cooperation for Accreditation, but there's a Pacific Accreditation Council, there is the South America, Arabian, and so on. And all these regional accreditation organizations are part of IAF, International Accreditation Forum, and when they sign MLA, imply that at that moment, all the verification issued at the national level by a verification body, accredited by accreditation body, part of this system, is a guarantee because this accreditation is recognized worldwide at the international level. So this is my short presentation, but I'm bored and happy to collect more questions by your side. And I also hope that Romain now is in connection and is able to participate to this discussion. Romain, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Romain, yeah.
Okay, so finally I'm back.
Good to know.
I have no idea of what happened until now, so I assume Zelina presentation was good and yours was good also, Daniele? Yeah, okay.
Yes, I only to inform you that I introduced 40067 and also some activity in connection with the verification of 67 and 64 part 1.
Okay, thanks a lot. I guess you saved this presentation. So let's move to the presentation about carbon footprint of organization. So I hope now everything is working well. So just to reconnect with what Zelina presented to you before, so and what Daniele presented to you as well. So Daniele spoke about the ISO 40067 and some part of the verification and validation standards related to 14064-1, 65, and 66. And I will focus on the ISO 40064-1 and briefly talk about the 40069, which is a technical report in support to the application to the implementation of the 40064-1. So the 40064-1 is a standard about specification and guidance for an organization at organization level to quantify and report greenhouse gas emissions and removal. So basically, it's how to quantify and communicate GHG footprint, basically at organizational level. So I'm assuming the fact that a lot of people are really familiar with GHG protocol, which is another private standard, and ISO 40064-1 is the ISO standard on this topic. So the ISO 40064-1 really provides some specification and principles and requirements at the organization level for quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and removal. And it includes also some requirements for the design, development, management of and reporting and verification for organization GHG inventory. Basically, just to give you a rough example of the implementation of the 40064-1, this standard is the one which is used by the French mandatory scheme for greenhouse gas reporting. Basically what we call the Grenelle Law 2, but it's also a standard that is used in support for the application of the Article Law 173-4 in France. So about the schedule of the development of this standard. So the first edition issued in 2006, and it has been revised 3 years later. The first revision process agreed that there wasn't any need to revise the standard. So an alternative ways was used, which was to develop the technical report 40069, which was then used to revise the 40064-1 for the version that has been released last year. So thanks to the 40069, a lot of enhancement has been integrating in the revision of the 40064-1, which make it more consistent with the evolution of the practices and the international practices in terms of GHG quantification and reporting. So a lot of clarification has been made on what we call the reporting boundaries. New categorization of GHG inventory have been defined. A new process also has been determined has been defined to help the user to determine which significant indirect emission shall be quantified and report when you do a GHG footprint at the organization level. Also, a new chapter have been developed and updated to integrate some mitigation activities, which is really helpful for companies that not only quantify GHG emission, but also want to communicate about their mitigation activities. And a lot of clarification have been also made to really support the reporting process. Just to give you a rough understanding of the new categorization. So basically, the 40064-1 past version in 2006, the older version, obliged an organization who want to be compliant with the 40064-1 to quantify direct GHG emission and indirect energy and indirect GHG emission related to the use of energy. So basically the scope 1 and scope 2 for those who are familiar with GHG protocol. But what we call the scope 3, so indirect emission, other indirect emission, was only recommended but not mandatory. So now with the new version of the 40064-1, all the direct emission and all the significant indirect emissions are mandatory now when you want to quantify and communicate and be compliant with this document, with this standard. So basically there is a new categorization, so direct GHG emission and removal with 5 subcategories. Indirect GHG emission from imported energy, so basically what we use to call the scope 2. And now 4 additional indirect category of emissions. So indirect GHG emission for transportation with 5 subcategory, indirect GHG emission from product used by the organization with five subcategory, Indirect GHG emission associated with the use of product from organization, with 4 subcategories, and other indirect GHG emission from other sources. So now the main, as I said, the main improvement of this methodology, of this standard, is the fact that the organization shall apply and document the process to determine which indirect emissions to include in its GHG inventory. And an additional annex has been developed also to provide some guidance and criteria for the process to identify and select the significant indirect emissions. For instance, an organization can decide to select indirect GHG emission based on the magnitude of those emissions, the level of influence the company has to modify or to reduce or increase those emissions. The risk of opportunity aspect is also an important criteria. We also recognize the fact that some sector can have developed specific guidance to identify which indirect emissions are significant, but you can also use additional criteria such as outsourcing or employees engagement. As I said, a new chapter has been introduced on mitigation activities in order to encourage the organization to report GHG reduction initiative, but also to support the organizations that want to set target to GHG reductions. So, some other requirements have been developed, and so basically there are a lot of clarification and requirement for some specific items such as electricity. How do you quantify GHG emission due to the use of electricity, but also some additional requirements and guidance for biogenic carbon. So yeah. Basically this standard has the 40064-1 has been really improved compared to the previous version, and is really supposed to be fully aligned with the most advanced best practices on GHG quantification and reporting. I hope this presentation was good, because I don't hear anything. I still can't hear anything, but anyway, I will then give the floor to my colleague Céline PHILIPPS, who will introduce the ISO standards on adaptation challenge. So I hope it will work. So if it doesn't work, just let me know or send me an email or whatever to communicate with me, because I'm still blind in this presentation. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Romain. We can see it on the screen, the presentation. So I think it's working.
So the floor is yours, Céline, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Were there no questions for Romain? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So Zelina and Romain have already introduced 14,090 in their talks, and so I'm very pleased to be able to this afternoon to give you more information about this new standard, which was published in July in 2019 and has just been published as a French standard, NF, a few weeks ago. We're very excited. So I'm working at ADEME, the same organization as Romain POIVET. So we're working at the French Environment Agency. And we're very excited that this standard has been published, because we believe it's a key tool for businesses now, and for also maybe some public authorities to be able to show that they're on board with where climate change adaptation is concerned. So just to reset the scene on the difference between climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. So the talks you've just heard by Daniele and Romain concerned standards on mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, counting your greenhouse gas emissions. And adaptation is all about preparing for the physical impacts of climate change. We sometimes call them the physical risks of climate change. Just so to remind you that scientists currently estimate that the global average temperature is 1 degree centigrade above the average temperature in pre-industrial times. And so our climate has already changed over the past century. And this has led to not only increases in average temperatures, but also changes in rain patterns, an evolution in the severity and the frequency of droughts and floods and other extreme events. Sea level is rising, and this leads to food and water shortages in many areas, and also a phenomenon which is on the increase is the climate refugees moving from one country to another. So all these impacts are already happening in various parts of the world, and they're going to increase. And so if you, as an organization, want to be prepared for this, you need to get on board with adaptation, so how to deal with the unavoidable physical impacts of climate change, to prevent or minimize the damage that these physical impacts cause on your organization. And also there may be opportunities in being prepared for these for this new climate. Yes, this standard also encourages organizations to take advantage of any opportunities that may arise in the new climate. So adaptation is complementary to mitigation. Mitigation is the reduction of the emissions of greenhouse gases by an organization to reduce the phenomenon of climate change. Of course, reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases is the priority for any organization today. And so one of the important principles in ISO 14090 is that climate change adaptation also leads to reductions in the emissions of greenhouse gases wherever possible, and never leads to increases in greenhouse gas emissions. One more general slide before we get into the nitty-gritty of the standard. So here it's just to explain that currently at ISO, climate change adaptation is being dealt with in management system standards. So management system standards are the 14,000 family. And so these are horizontal standards that work across an organization. In the European Union, the strategy has been to be complementary to the work going on at ISO level, and so to work more at integrating climate change adaptation into the sector-specific standards, so a vertical approach. And the work that's happening at the moment is attempting to mainstream, so I'm sorry, I can't see my slides anymore. So I don't know why I can't see my slides anymore. If I'm going to try and share my, and let's hope that that works. Okay. Okay. Have I lost everybody? Yeah. So we've lost Romain. And let me just try one more thing. Okay, so we're back at I don't know why. You can't see my, yes, you can see my slides. So I'll just come back to the slides we were at. So at a European level, there's work ongoing to help standards in the energy sectors, in the transport sector, and in the construction sector integrate adaptation. Help these standard makers, standard writers, to understand what it means for them that the climate is changing and how it will impact the different requirements in their existing standards or in any new standards. The objective being that the European Union wishes to have more resilient infrastructure with higher lifespan and not to have higher costs of impacts. So now I'm going to go into more detail about the content of NFE and ISO 14090. So first of all, what does it help organizations do? So this standard has been designed to identify, prepare for, manage the impacts of climate change. As I said, it's encourages businesses and other organizations to look at opportunities and also the harmful impacts of climate change. And it will demonstrate to your investors and customers that you're using the best practice available. And the objective is that an organization will improve their performance by adapting their management system using the different requirements of the standard, and create a new organizational culture that engages in a continuous cycle of self-evaluation, correction, and improvement. This slide summarizes the different parts of the standard. So it was published, as I said, in July 2019. And so the standard has 15 terms and definitions relating to climate change adaptation, and also another concept which the international group of experts thought was very important to include is the concept of transformation. Climate change adaptation involves adjusting the systems we operate in to reduce the harmful effects of climate change and benefit from the opportunities. But there will be a point at which, when climate has changed so much, adaptation will not be an option anymore. And many organizations will have to consider transforming their fundamental attributes. And this is where transformation comes in as an important definition. We don't know how fast climate will change in the future, but we do know it's going to change even more than it's already changed. So many organizations already today have to start preparing for transformation. Another important concept in the standard is adaptive capacity. This is a concept that was proposed by scientists of the IPCC and is also used a lot when looking at organizations by funding institutions. And so the standard has it as one of the core concepts, and we'll come back to that later. Adaptive management is also a key concept. We are in, so organizations are changing, facing a changing environment, a changing climate, and to face this continually changing context of their activities, they're having to develop an adaptive management culture. There are 10 principles in the standard. Here I've highlighted 4, which I'll come back to in the main body then of the text when I'm describing what the core content of the standard is. Flexibility. Flexibility, an organization must remain flexible if it is to be able to continuously adapt to the changing climate. Robustness, so an organization should develop a culture of using decision-making processes which are robust for a changing environment. Transparency, it's felt that it's very important for organizations to be very clear about the information they're using when they're adapting to climate change, and not to maybe give information which third parties would not be able to understand or misunderstand. And synergy between adaptation and mitigation, I mentioned this before. A key principle of this standard is that any action to adapt to the impacts of climate change must also contribute wherever is possible to the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The standard has 36 requirements, and it also has many guidelines on what adaptation is and how to go about adaptation in your organization. The standard has been designed to be usable by any organization, whatever scale, size, local, regional, international, and whatever the activity the organization is carrying out. It's also a framework standard. Zelina mentioned this, which means that it can be used also by standards writers who want to better understand what climate change adaptation is all about. The main clauses in the standard deal with pre-planning, assessing climate change impacts, including opportunities, adaptation planning, the implementation of the adaptation plan, monitoring and evaluation, reporting and communication. So I'm now going to go through these different clauses. There's one slide for each, so you get to understand the essential steps of the climate change adaptation process in this management system standard. So pre-planning involves assessing the capability of your organization to undergo all the process described in the different clauses of 14,090. So do you have the leadership and the governance needed to deal with adaptation? Do you have the human resources? Has everyone's role and responsibility been clearly defined? Do you have the financial resources? Do you have the required levels of expertise and knowledge in-house? And if not, do you know where to find them externally? Do you know which the best information and data sources are? And then once you start to prepare the climate change adaptation process, the standard requires that you document and describe your capability gaps and establish a work program to fill these gaps, to commit the human and financial resources necessary, and identify all the relevant interested parties to develop a plan to engage with them. So once you've finished this first pre-planning stage, then you're set to start looking at what the impacts of climate change are on your organization. And so here, the standard is very open to which method of assessment. No one method is actually imposed. The standard mentions risk assessment methods, vulnerability assessment methods, threshold analysis methods as being relevant for the context of climate change, but is very open as to which method the organization wishes to use. What is most important in the standard is the focus on the quality of the assessment process and the transparency of the results. And I've flagged up here transparency, which was one of our 10 principles I talked about previously. So during the assessment of the climate change impacts, the organization has to be looking at the threats and opportunities due to the past climate change and future climate change. And also it has to be looking not only at the slow onset impacts, so the chronic impacts of climate change, such as increases in average temperature. It also needs to be looking at the sudden impacts due to extreme events, for example, the impacts of droughts. And the organization needs to be looking at the direct impacts and the direct impacts of climate change on itself. An important part, as I said, of this standard is to be looking at the organization's adaptive capacity. This means looking at your financial resources, your human resources, your technical resources, and also your organizational capability. And so this clause requires that you carry out an assessment of your organization's adaptive capacity. And finally, the clause requires that you document the whole process, all the data and information sources used, and the uncertainties associated with all this information, in order to be transparent about the results of the assessment process. The next phase is the adaptation planning phase. So here the objective is to understand what the climate change adaptation priorities are for the organization, and then what needs to be done to address these priorities. So it's required that the organization develop an adaptation plan where it will state how it's going to incorporate and embed climate change adaptation into its different company policies, organizational policies, strategies, and plans. This plan should also identify a range of actions that will address the adaptation priorities. The choice of actions will be made using appropriate decision-making methods. And again, here the standard is open as to which decision method is used, but it does give examples of methods. You may have heard of some of them, for example, adaptation pathways, decision mapping, robust decision making, are today decision-making methods considered to be particularly well suited to climate change adaptation. The adaptation plan should also state the adaptive management approach that the organization will use to enable the capture of new knowledge and learning, because not only will climate be changing over the next decades, but also the knowledge we have about climate change, the knowledge we have about the impacts of climate change, and the knowledge we have about the best adaptation solutions. And also, of course, we are all learning from on-the-ground experience. So in order to be flexible, an organization needs to have a relevant learning and monitoring and evaluation system. The adaptation plan will also state how it will develop its adaptation capacity. And sorry, I've clicked before faster than I'd expected. So now we're on to the implementation phase. And so this implementation clause requires the organization to explain how the adaptation plan will be transformed into action within the organization. So in the implementation plan, the roles and responsibilities of different people in the organization will be stated, and the organizational capability and the resources to deliver the different actions will also be described. And finally, the implementation plan will explain how the organization has developed flexibility in learning processes. Another requirement during the implementation phase is that the top management of the organization demonstrate leadership, commitment, and accountability. So it's very important, if your adaptation process is to succeed, for the leadership to be directing and supporting persons to contribute to the effectiveness of the adaptation actions. Also, the top management needs to be showing commitment, ensuring the integration of the adaptation plan into the organization's business processes, and commitment to ensuring that the resources needed are available. And finally, the top management needs to be accountable for the effectiveness of the adaptation actions. The next clause describes monitoring and evaluation. So, as I've said, it's one of the keys to the success of climate change adaptation is for an organization to be flexible. So how can you inform the adaptive management of your climate change adaptation? How is the organization going to generate knowledge, learning, and evidence? All this, it has to be described in the monitoring and evaluation plan, which will document also the results of the monitoring and evaluation, and look at whether the existing adaptation and implementation plans are still valid, and be used to update policies, strategies, and plans using the outcomes of the evaluation. So it's important for an organization when it sets out on climate change adaptation to decide on the best periodicity of monitoring and evaluation. For example, this may be every 6 months or every year for the monitoring, but the evaluation will probably happen at the end of a natural policy cycle within the organization. However, as well as this regular monitoring and evaluation, the organization needs to allow for ad hoc monitoring and evaluation whenever you have a significant event that hadn't been foreseen. So there may be major impacts due to an extreme climate event, for example, or whenever new information is received where it's felt as though it's really important to revise the adaptation plan and implementation plans. And finally, the standard explains what it feels is important when you're reporting and communicating on climate change adaptation. So the standard does not require all organizations to communicate about their climate change adaptation process, but it does require that if you communicate, you use best practice, and so that in your climate change adaptation report, best practice would be that you're using accurate data, information, verifiable information, that it's relevant and not misleading. And also, it's felt that a climate change adaptation report, if it's published, should be easily accessible and free of charge. So I finished now the presentation of the different clauses of ISO 14090. And just to summarize, this is my last slide. So climate change adaptation, enables organizations to manage the adverse impacts of climate change, but also enables them to identify any opportunities. And so this standard can be used by any organization, and it will help the organizations identify, prepare for, and manage the impacts of climate change. It will also demonstrate to the investors and customers of the organization that the organization is using best practice. The main deliverables of this standard will be the adaptation plan, including an implementation plan, a monitoring and evaluation plan, and arrangements for reporting and communication. And finally, one of the main focuses also of the standard is that climate change adaptation is not something that the organization carries out separately to the rest of its activities. Climate change adaptation has to be embedded into the organization's policies, strategies, and plans, because climate will be changing now for quite a while, and this adaptation process is only just starting. So that I finished there, Romain, if you want to take over again. No, so then I had a couple of slides. Sorry, so I can't see my slides on the screen anymore. There's a couple of slides about the other standards that are due to be published. So let me go. Sorry, I'm going to have to go through to slide 15. So this next slide was just presenting other standards dealing with climate change adaptation, which are pending. The first one is a standard which details the process, one example of risk assessment using the impact chain methodology, and this is ISO 14091. It's due to be published in 2020. Also, there are some ISO technical specifications which will be published next year on adaptation planning for local authorities. And that's ISO TS 14092. And finally, a standard which is aimed this time at financial institutions and which deals with adaptation but also mitigation. ISO 14097 is a framework that includes principles and requirements for assessing and reporting investments and financing activities regarding climate change. There, so I'll stop there. Romain, if you want to take... Okay, I don't know if you can... Yeah, can you still hear me, Romain? So I shall hand over to the next speaker.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, okay. I try to not touch anything on this on the screen, because each time I touch something, it shut down the presentation, or yeah. Anyway, so there is so I think there are some questions to you, Céline,
Okay.
in the chat room. So I think we can take time to answer those questions, knowing the fact that there won't be any further presentation, especially on the ISO 40197 because of technical issues.
Okay.
So I think we can take time to answer live and direct to the questions in the chat room.
Okay, so I'm going back up then to so Eliane M asks, what are the options if the results, this is a question posted at 16:30. What are the options if the results of the assessment show low adaptive capacities or robustness, so low financial resources and few human resources? Well, if that's what the initial pre-planning assessment shows, it means that you can't embark upon climate adaptation until you have the relevant adaptive capacities or robustness. Yes, there's no point in undergoing the whole, starting out on the whole process if you don't have the expertise, if you don't have the financial resources, the human resources. So I'm sorry, I'm not sure I answer that satisfactorily, but it is a long process and quite an involved process, so you can't undergo it lightly. So there's another question at 16:34 from Thomas G, saying, how do you reconcile the pace suggested by this standard and the emergency we're facing in terms of climate? The UN has restated yesterday that emissions should be decreasing 7.5% per year. What magnitude of savings you expect to be achieved through application of this standard? Okay, so ISO 14090 will not necessarily lead to lead to decreases in emissions of greenhouse gases. One of the objectives is it certainly will not encourage increases in greenhouse gas emissions. That's when I was talking about the principle of synergy between mitigation and adaptation. But the process we're describing in this standard is really, once the physical impacts of climate change hit you, how does your organization manage them? Manage these impacts and the risks due to these impacts. And of course, then the risks due to these impacts are expected tomorrow and after tomorrow. So the pace suggested by this standard is that we already need to be adapting today. Many organizations are already facing the physical impacts of climate change, and to stay competitive and relevant in the market today, and to be sure that they're not carrying out actions that deteriorate their environmental performance, they need to already be looking at these physical impacts and choosing solutions, adaptation solutions, which lead to increase their performance. So we're dealing with something that's very real for many organizations already today, and many organizations will be faced with the physical impacts of climate change within the coming years in the short, medium, and long term. So climate change adaptation is about adapting to today's climate, but also preparing for tomorrow's climate. And that's why we describe processes such as transformation, where even though today your system, your organization may be viable, in the long term, you may have to change fundamentally the activities, products, and services of your organization to be relevant in the new climate. Going check. Then I'm trying to find more about adaptation. Maybe one more. I'm sorry, I'm going to pick it randomly. It doesn't linking check.
Does the ISO give some quantitative references regarding human resources or financial mean threshold under which the organization cannot be adaptive?
No, ISO gives no quantitative references. That will be up to the organization to determine for its particular conditions what the thresholds are. The aim of this standard is just to suggest methodologies and encourage you to use them. Okay, is there time for more? Or not?
I guess you can take another question on adaptation, and then I will try to answer the last ones that are more general, I guess.
Okay. So the last question, is there an organization in charge of promoting this standard? So in France, it's AFNOR who is in charge of promoting this standard. So this standard is now a French standard, NF, as well as being a European and ISO standard. So AFNOR is going to promote it nationally. And so I'm working for the French Environment Agency, and at the French Environment Agency, ADEME, next year we are planning to help organizations who want to experiment using this standard. So if you're interested in using this standard, well, please don't hesitate to contact me. My email address is celine.philipps@adem.fr. And we would like in 2020 then to accompany a few organizations who are ready, who have the capability to undergo the processes described in this standard. And then, of course, once we have the experience of these organizations, then we would share it with the rest of the French community. Okay?
Okay, thank you, Céline. Maybe just in order to reconnect the dot with the main topic of this session, and thanks to Charlotte J. There is this question of going back to the main topic of this session: how to use international standards to build climate actions. Are ISO standards the only international ones? If so, how not to get lost between the different ISO? Yes, that's a real interesting questions even. So basically, I would say that standards in general can support to develop some policies or strategies and to communicate about it, and being sure that everybody share the same practices and answer the requirements from standards. So there are more they can be used as a support. I would say, for instance, if we take the ISO 14001 for environmental management, I mean, every company wants to implement environmental management. It's quite obvious for a company to use the ISO 14001. So because there is maybe it's the most famous one, and I'm pretty sure if we ask the same question to companies, do you know the EMAS standards developed by Europe, by the European Commission? I'm pretty sure nobody will know anything about the EMAS standard. But yeah, it's just about how those standards position themselves on the market. Yeah, the ISO standard is not the only organization. ISO is not the only organization who develops standards. There are other standards such as those developed by European Commission, by Europe within the Sensenelec. But ISO are the only standards that are developed at international level. Involving national standardization bodies, so involving countries and involving experts from countries. So for me, as an expert involved in ISO development, in ISO standard development for climate, I would say it is a question of trust and confidence in those standards, but also in the process they respect to deliver such standards. So how not to get lost between the different ISO? But it really depends on which topic you want to deal with. So for instance, if you want to deal with climate, I will highly recommend to use climate standards that are developed by the ISO TC 207 SC7 subcommittee 7, because it's the subcommittee who is in charge of climate standard. So there are not so many ISO standards that deals with climate stuff. Yep. I think I hope I answered this question. I don't know if Céline, you want to complement my my answer, but another question: who designed this norm? So who designed? Yeah. So question from Eliane. Basically, those standards, as I said, are developed by ISO at ISO level, involving experts from different countries that are not, let's say, working for themselves, but working for the country. So basically, Céline and me, when we are involved in standard development, we don't speak for Céline or for myself. We or for ADEME, we speak for France. So we develop, we argue and we propose expertise from French side. So I hope it answered this question about who designed the norm in general.
And maybe, if I may, so I discovered the ISO process because I was in the working group that developed 14090, and it's there's a very strong focus on consensus, and so there's a lot of debate in the expert working group, and so I am actually now very convinced that these standards do represent best practice at an international level. They're very powerful because they go through this process of international expertise and the search for consensus amongst the experts. So that makes them very interesting tools.
Yeah, I support. So if there is no burning question, I would propose to go to the conclusion of this this session. So it was just kind of a teaser about ISO standards on climate. I hope it helps you to see clearer about ISO climate standards. If we didn't answer all your question, feel free to directly ask to the French National Standardization Body your question. So basically to AFNOR. AFNOR is the organization in charge of standard development in France and who represent France in ISO development process. As you noticed, the ISO climate standards are really addressing the question of historically of GHG quantification for organization and for products. Now there are those new climate standard about adaptation. I can already tell you that a new standard will be developed starting next year about carbon neutrality. So how to deal with carbon neutrality, how to communicate about carbon neutrality. It's a really huge topic, and so I would invite you to participate to those to those standards development, because it will help you to anticipate new standard on the market, and it will help you to better understand how to quantify and communicate and to elaborate your strategy, for instance, on carbon neutrality, but also on adaptation and mitigation in general. So there are still a lot of topic to be addressed by climate standard. As you may know, the standard are revised every 3 years. There is a procedure to determine if a standard need to be revised or not. So I would say standards are always up to date with best practices. And I would like to conclude this session by really thanks the speakers, so Daniele PERNIGOTTI, Zelina, Ibrahim, Céline PHILIPPS, and especially a double thanks because they saved this session while I was blind on this presentation. So thanks a lot to you, and thanks especially to Zelina who accepted to be there at this time. Because Zelina is based in Malaysia, so there is a huge time difference. So thanks a lot to Zelina, and thanks a lot to you who attended this session. And feel free to contact AFNOR, and thank you Laurence Thomas from AFNOR to communicate your email address in the chat box. So thanks a lot, and see you soon, and have a good end of day. Bye bye.